When a homeless man stopped Barron Trump, reaching out his hand and humbly asking for just $1, no one could have imagined the astonishing consequences that this simple act of generosity would trigger. What began quietly, almost unnoticed, soon transformed into a powerful movement that crossed borders and united a once broken family. On that day, the city pulsed with a frenetic rhythm. Cars honked incessantly, hurried pedestrians zigzagged along narrow sidewalks, and the murmur of voices spread through the air, composing a chaotic symphony known only to major urban centers. And in the midst of this seemingly ordinary scene, a single gesture of compassion would be the spark that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. At the busy corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, a man named Leonard leaned against the grimy wall of an old convenience store, his clothes worn in multiple layers, trying in vain to block the biting winter wind. A cardboard sign lay beside him with the words, "Anything helps, God bless," but almost no one stopped to read it. At 42 years old, Leonard had been living on the streets for just over a year, the result of a series of setbacks that left him jobless, homeless, and gradually hopeless. The rush of passers-by came and went, always too fast to notice anything beyond their own hurry. Leonard's tired gaze followed the different types of footwear that passed before him. Simple sneakers, hurried heels, impeccably polished dress shoes. Then suddenly, a pair of absolutely pristine white sneakers stopped just a few steps away. They were the kind of shoes you'd expect to see on someone young, privileged, someone who likely had never felt the burden of sleeping out in the cold. Intrigued, Leonard looked up and saw a tall teenager with a confident posture, hands in the pockets of a designer jacket. The daylight made him squint, and it took a few seconds for him to realize he recognized that face from somewhere, but he couldn't immediately remember who the boy was. The teenager seemed to be waiting for something at the traffic light, absently looking at his own phone while a few people nearby whispered, and somewhat shyly pointed their phones to record the scene. Amid the noise of cars and the city's usual rush, Leonard, who generally waited for a look of acknowledgement before asking for spare change, felt odd, drawing that boy's attention. Even so, there was something about the boy's calm demeanor and distinct presence that encouraged him. "Hey kid, could you spare $1?" Leonard ventured, his voice weak and hoarse from the cold and dehydration. The young man, who was focused on his messages, suddenly froze, tilting his head to make sure he had heard correctly. When he turned around, his expression was indecipherable. There was no contempt, no cheap pity, just a serious curiosity. "What do you need it for?" he asked calmly but firmly, as if every word was carefully measured. The weight of his question surprised Leonard, who wasn't used to this kind of genuine interest. "For a coffee, maybe a sandwich if I'm lucky," he replied, rubbing his hands together to ward off the cold. The boy put his phone in his pocket and moved closer, ignoring the curious and judgmental looks from people around them who couldn't understand why someone like him would bother interacting with a homeless man. "What's your name?" the boy asked in a serious voice, but without hostility. "Leonard," he whispered, feeling a lump form in his throat. No one usually bothered to ask his name. The teenager nodded slowly, still seeming to analyze every detail. "I'm Barron," he said naturally, without arrogance or false modesty, simply stating who he was. Immediately, Leonard was sure he'd seen him before, and soon realized that the boy's calm and distinctive presence were hallmarks of the former president's son. The chatter of the street seemed to return to normal, but between the two, an almost solemn atmosphere formed. Barron then crouched down to Leonard's eye level, a gesture that surprised him. No one had ever shown him such a demonstration of respect. "How long have you been here?" he asked, looking at Leonard with genuine concern. Even embarrassed to expose his own story, Leonard answered honestly, "Almost a year. The factory where I worked shut down, then I got sick, couldn't keep up the rent anymore." His words were laden with despair. As Leonard spoke, Barron listened attentively, showing no sign of judgment but rather an empathy that sparkled in his eyes. The murmurs on the street grew louder. Passers-by seemed unable to believe what they were seeing. Barron Trump, kneeling on the sidewalk, listening to the story of a man invisible to the rest of the world. "What about your family?" Barron asked, breaking the silence. Leonard's face contorted in a bitter expression. "I don't really have that anymore." My parents died years ago. My brother and I haven't spoken in ages. I've reached a point where there's nothing left to lose." Hearing those words, Barron frowned, as if pondering something far beyond that street corner. Then, in a move that made Leonard's heart race, the young man slipped his hand into his coat pocket. Leonard expected, at most, a single crumpled dollar, but what appeared before his eyes was a brand-new $100 bill, extended toward him calmly. "Here," Barron said, unfazed by Leonard's astonishment. "That should cover more than a coffee." The homeless man blinked in disbelief, taking the bill as if it were a rare treasure. "Are you serious?" he managed to ask, his voice trembling. In response, Barron merely shrugged. "Because I can." There was a studied nonchalance in his voice, but also a moving sincerity. It wasn't ostentatiousness, but a genuine willingness to help. However, before Leonard could express his gratitude, Barron leaned in closer and said in a serene tone, "But promise me one thing. If I help you today, you'll do what you can to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Leonard swallowed hard, feeling tears well up almost without warning. It was more than just money. It was a vote of confidence, a spark of hope on a cold day. And in that brief moment, in the middle of a noisy city, surrounded by onlookers and cell phone cameras, one simple act of charity planted the seed of something infinitely greater. Leonard tried to contain the involuntary tremor that ran through his body as he stared at the small piece of paper, with the scribbled address and the $100 bill now resting in his hands. In front of him, Barron Trump, the good Baron, as Leonard mentally nicknamed him, stood up, attracting the attention of an ever-growing crowd of onlookers. There were people filming, whispering, some just trying to make sense of that unusual scene. An heir to a powerful family displaying genuine concern for a stranger living on the streets. Seated on the ground, Leonard felt his cheeks grow hot with embarrassment upon noticing several cell phones pointed in his direction, but at the same time he experienced something he had long since forgotten, the feeling of truly being seen. His heart racing, he wanted to say thank you, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Barron, appearing just as calm as before, pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled a few lines. Without ceremony, he handed the scrap of paper to Leonard. "Show up here tomorrow morning," he said, pointing to the address he had just written. "They'll know who you are if you say I sent you. They'll help you start over." Leonard opened the paper. It was the name of a local resource and shelter center, one he had heard about in occasional street conversations. Until then, however, he had never mustered the courage to go there, partly because of wounded pride, partly because he doubted a second chance really existed. But now it was impossible to ignore the invitation, not after being seen so genuinely. Raising his gaze to Barron, Leonard felt a tangle of emotions: gratitude, timid hope, fear of being merely a showpiece in some viral video. He cleared his throat, his voice still hesitant. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, barely more than a whisper. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." The words came out almost defiantly, but carried above all the weight of years of disappointment. Leonard wasn't used to acts of kindness without a second motive. Barron, however, surprised him by tilting his head and replying serenely, "Because everyone has a story, Leonard, and yours isn't over. If I can do something to help, why wouldn't I?" The simple yet firm tone sounded authentic. Leonard felt the tension in his shoulders slowly ease, though a residue of skepticism still clung to him. Years of rejection and scornful looks had built up, creating a wall of distrust. Even so, what Barron said echoed differently in his mind. "No one does something like that for free." Leonard shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and self-preservation. "There's always a price." Barron crouched again, aiming to look Leonard in the eye as an equal. For a moment, the city noise seemed to vanish, as if only the two of them existed on that sidewalk. "Maybe some people do operate that way, but not me," said the young man, pointing to the scrap of paper Leonard was still holding. "That place will give you support if you're willing to help yourself too. All I ask is that you show up." Leonard felt tears threaten to rise. "If you're willing to help yourself too." That struck right at the core of the pessimism he had built up. With an almost imperceptible nod, he promised, "I will. I promise I'll try." Barron gave a genuine smile, one with no trace of sarcasm or self-promotion. It was just the expression of someone who believed he was doing the right thing. Standing up, he cast one last glance at Leonard. "Don't forget, tomorrow, early. And believe me, you're stronger than you think." Soon afterward, Barron disappeared among the silhouettes and cars, leaving behind a small stir of people who were still commenting on the unusual encounter. Leonard remained seated for a few more minutes, gazing at the address and the money, as he processed everything that had happened. A mixture of relief and anticipation filled his chest. Could this be the chance he had been begging the heavens for, night after night? The next day, well before the first rays of sunshine lit the streets of Cleveland, Leonard got to his feet. The previous night had been difficult, because despite the cold and uncertainties, there was a new emotion burning inside him: hope. He made his way to the address, a modest brick building with a simple sign: Hope Resource Center, Shelter and Community Support. Upon entering, he found a warm environment with people coming and going, each with a purpose. Some were enrolling in training programs, others seeking medical assistance, or talking quietly in counseling rooms. Immediately, a receptionist with a welcoming smile looked up and recognized him. "You must be Leonard, right?" she asked, standing to greet him. "We've been expecting you." A different kind of warmth spread through Leonard's body, and he couldn't suppress a sigh of relief. It was, without a doubt, the first time anyone had truly been waiting for him. He was then taken to a social worker, who received him with empathy and without judgment, asking about his story, his health, and his most urgent needs. Over the following hours, Leonard discovered that the center offered a comprehensive plan to help him regain control of his life. A temporary room at the shelter, medical care to assess his health, job training, and opportunities for employment. Though everything still felt very new and distant, the team made it clear he would no longer be alone on this journey. Later that same night, sitting on the simple bed in the shelter, Leonard replayed every detail of his encounter with Barron. He looked at the $100 bill now carefully stowed away, and at the paper with the address, thinking about the words that had impacted him the most. "If I help you today, you help yourself tomorrow." It was a reminder that his future depended not just on others' goodwill, but also on his own choices and his persistence in facing challenges. Meanwhile, far away, the virtual world reacted powerfully to that moment of empathy and solidarity. A video captured by one of the onlookers had gone viral on social media, showing Barron kneeling beside Leonard, handing him the bill and offering words of encouragement. Millions of people shared the footage, praising Barron's attitude, questioning prejudices toward the Trump family, and above all, feeling moved to see that behind political headlines was a teenager capable of sincere empathy. In just a few hours, the story spread across news sites, generating every kind of opinion, from skeptical criticism to applause and support. There were those who doubted Barron's intentions, calling it a publicity stunt, but many let themselves be inspired by the simple yet rare gesture. In the shelter bedroom where he now rested, Leonard knew nothing about the online reaction or the media debates. Still, he felt that moment echo within him, as if the gears of his destiny had finally begun to turn in a new direction. For the first time in a long while, the word tomorrow brought not just anxiety, but also the possibility of rebirth. As the days turned into weeks, Leonard felt that each new dawn brought an even brighter glimmer of hope. His obligations at the Hope Resource Center became an essential part of his routine. Counseling sessions helped him confront old fears, while job skills workshops revealed abilities he never knew he had. Paul, his younger brother, began visiting regularly, often accompanying him to meetings and providing a supportive shoulder in moments when despair still threatened to return. It was a stark contrast to the past, when the two hadn't spoken in over a decade, each bearing resentments and regrets that had seemed insurmountable. Now, together, they discovered that, fragile as it might be, family affection could still withstand the weight of so many years of estrangement. News of the brothers' reunion, fueled by social media and ongoing news reports about Barron's act, took on a deeply moving aura. People who had cut ties with family members found the courage to reach out, inspired by Leonard and Paul's story. A wave of reconciliation began to spread quietly throughout the country, as if Barron's simple act of generosity had ignited a collective spark of empathy. Meanwhile, donations poured into the Hope Resource Center, allowing the expansion of its services. New projects were launched, including long-term psychological counseling and more robust job placement programs. From one day to the next, Leonard found himself not only as a beneficiary of these programs, but also as a kind of living symbol of what solidarity, combined with the courage to try again, could accomplish. Amid all this attention, Leonard struggled not to feel overwhelmed. After all, there were still doubts, painful memories, and a past marked by losing his home, his savings, and the self-esteem he had spent decades building. Sometimes emotions would surge unexpectedly. A stronger smell of coffee reminded him of nights spent in the cold. A political news segment took him back to the time he lost his job at the factory, and the shadows of the past haunted him. In those moments, Paul was tireless in offering the support he now provided. There were also the center's counselors, always ready to hear his stories or help him face yet another day of uncertainties. Beyond this supportive environment, Leonard's name continued to echo in the frenzy of social media. Not infrequently, volunteers or curious individuals showed up at the shelter asking for him, wanting to meet the sidewalk legend who had been reborn thanks to the young heir. At first, the constant presence of strangers frightened him. He feared being seen merely as a charity case or a media miracle without real personal worth. But gradually, he realized that each question, each visit, was laden with stories similar to his own, from people looking for inspiration to change their own lives, or from family members of someone living on the street who wanted to understand how they could help. Thus, Leonard came to see this interest not as an intrusion, but as a way of extending the chain of solidarity set in motion by that random encounter with Barron. During one such visit, a young mother who had come to donate food shared that her sister had gone through the same ordeal as Leonard, wandering the streets after losing her job. "When I saw your video with the Barron, I realized I still had time to do something for her," she confessed, her eyes brimming with emotion. And Leonard once again felt the power of his own transformation reflected in someone else's life, realizing that, in a way, his past suffering was now turning into a bridge for others' hope. Over time, with every smile shared with Paul, every application form completed in search of a new job, or every brief exchange with someone who was inspired by him, Leonard grew more certain that his encounter with Barron had been much more than a stroke of luck. It was the first step in a long but rewarding journey toward regaining his dignity and the ability to dream. And with every step forward, he remembered the words spoken by the boy who approached him on that cold day. Small actions can lead to something bigger. Perhaps that was exactly what was happening. The simple act of extending a helping hand could trigger an infinite chain of changes, connecting destinies that never imagined they would cross paths.